right. I did like the walk-on music. Thanks, Laura. Really, really excited to be here. I don't know if we want to get the presentation on the slides, but I have 3 goals for today. The first goal is to just blow your mind at all these really interesting things that are happening in the world. And part of it is we're stuck in our little bubbles so often, right? When we kind of go to work, and even just here in North America and here in Toronto or wherever else we're from. But there is a whole other world out there that I want to bring to you. So that's my first thing. The second thing I want to do is scare the crap out of you, okay? We're living right now in a disrupt or be disrupted world. And it might not seem like that yet, but it never does until it happens, okay? And so I really want us to get into this mindset of, you know, this isn't like a cute exercise when we think about digital transformation. And I'm not saying you're thinking that way. But I really want us to start thinking about that this is going to be core to a business in the next couple of years, right? And that like the chief digital officer, the chief innovation officer are going to be the people that prevent a company from being disrupted in a big way or disrupting other industries. And then the last thing I want to do is really get us into this mindset of how do we actually take the first step, right? What mindsets, behaviors, attitudes do we need to have to make this happen? To give you some insight, Laura did a great job talking about my background, but to give you a little bit of insight where I sort of came from, I grew up in Calgary, okay? So the least sort of innovative mindsets around, right? We didn't really have a history of innovation. I was very much focused on oil and gas, and I was not exposed to really anything growing up. And it was very lucky that I got, when I came to Toronto, exposed to the innovation landscape, and I've always been really interested in technology. Found myself down in San Francisco, and when you're in San Francisco in Silicon Valley, you're waking up to self-driving cars every single day, right? I got exposed to VR technology probably 3 or 4 years before Facebook bought the Oculus, right? Which was like their first major play, or got exposed to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency back in 2014. And when I reflect on my experiences, and I think about the people who I grew up with in our traditional networks, like high school and university, right? And even people who I know now, they're not being exposed to any of this stuff. And it's not their fault, right? It's literally the environment that I was in, I was able to be exposed to some of these things, right? But the very interesting thing is like, it's not a secret, right? It's not a secret that Google was working on their self-driving cars 6+ years ago. And now it's starting to get a little bit more sexy because Elon Musk and some of these other folks are talking about it, right? It's not a secret that Jennifer Doudna, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, created this new gene editing technology that's going to dramatically change the world, right? So when, I don't know if you're thinking about designer babies or cloning, or if you heard some of that stuff in movies or sci-fi, but it's actually happening now. And then the implications for disease and some of these other things, human longevity. But it's very much just because I was exposed to that environment. And so I really want to expose some of that environment here today, right? And get you really excited about it. So I think the best way to do that is start small, right? Let's ease into it, and then I'll show you guys some really cool stuff. So here's a reality check of how fast the world is actually changing. Some of you recognize some of these icons and these brands, right? So you have Facebook, Uber, Netflix, PayPal, Airbnb, Snapchat, Twitter, Spotify, Pokemon Go. Some of your kids, or even you might be using the app, and then the one on the right is Tinder, it's the dating app. These are the valuations for these companies right now, okay? So Facebook's $574 billion, Snapchat is $18 billion. This is literally just taking pictures and then having them disappear, right? And it's an $18 billion company. One of my kids could code this in their room tonight if they wanted to. And then we have Spotify, $31 billion. These are huge numbers, okay? But to give you an idea of how big they are, if you look at some of the largest companies in Canada, and even in the world, right? CIBC is a $40 billion company, 45,000 employees, and it was founded in 1867, right? 150 years ago. And Uber, founded in 2009, less than 10 years ago, is almost double the value, okay? And the reason why I'm showing valuation is to show a measure of impact. In such a short period of time, a lot of value can be created, right? Similarly, Facebook's a $574 billion company founded in 2004, right? Compared to Ford, it's a $49 billion company around little over 100 years ago. So when we think about digital transformation and innovation and how the world's changing, like, this is happening in a very big way. The economic impact here is huge, right? It's also really cool, but the economic impact here is huge, okay? So how do we really set ourselves up to take advantage of this? If we think about data, okay, there has been more data that has been created in the last 2 years than all of our other previous years combined in human history. In 2 years, okay? And it's going to continue to double. Why is it going to continue to double? Like, why are we generating so much data? Partly because of these things, right? We have sensors now. Think about in the next couple of years when Google Homes and Alexas and Fitbits and all of these things are everywhere. We have smart clothing, all this stuff. All of these devices are collecting data, okay? So now we should be thinking, okay, we have a bunch of this data. How can we actually use it? For what purpose? Start with the why and then figure out how to actually go deep into the guts of this thing. And you might have heard about things like big data, right? Or machine learning. These are tools to really extract meaningful insights from a lot of the data that you have. And the first step you might be thinking, I was like, crap, we don't really store any of this stuff in the first place, right? Like, how do we actually build our databases so that we can actually go in with the guts and rip it apart? And so maybe that's the first step, but thinking about what you actually want to accomplish, and then what do I need to do is step one, right? Because there's a lot of really interesting things you can do here. So this is to further, just one last time, nail down the point of where we're at in human history, okay? So we're here, and this is literally our progress throughout human history, like all of human history combined, okay? So here is like when we discovered fire, right? And then it was actually like thousands of years later till we discovered the wheel, right? And then it was like thousands and thousands of years later till we discovered like irrigation and innovations in farming so we can urbanize cities. And then thousands and thousands of years later, we figured out, you know, the steam engine and the printing press and vaccines and all that stuff. Like literally in this sliver, right here, right in this sliver. We got the internet, we got mobile phones, we got cars, we got planes, right? All of these really interesting things that we take for granted today. I don't know how many of you have kids, but oftentimes when I'm speaking to young people, I'm like, the internet is new, right? Like, it doesn't feel that way. The internet is new. More than 50% of the people that grew up in today's world grew up in a world without the internet. How crazy is it to think about that, right? We almost feel accustomed to it, and sometimes it's hard to remember when the internet wasn't new, and right, you were using like the dial-up, and you'd always get the sound when you were trying to call. Like kids today, they don't remember that stuff, but it really is new, and it feels so normal. And imagine how normal it feels to them because they're growing up in a world that's ever changing. So in 10 years, when we have flying cars around, right, how quickly is that going to feel normal? In the first year, it's going to be like, wow, I can't believe we have flying cars. In 10 years, it's like, I can't believe we just had cars on the ground and we had to move around our infrastructure. We could just fly above everything else, right? When I was growing up, software engineering was the next big thing, right? If you were in software engineering, you were going to change the world. Today, we have things like AI, VR, quantum computing, nanotechnology, IoT. You might not even know what some of these words mean. I'll get into some of them. Brain-machine interfaces that we talked about. So one of our students created a device that can control electric cars with her mind, right? Or your Spotify playlist or whatever, right? But But you can do that today. Genetic engineering, curing diseases, human longevity, cellular agriculture, all of these things, okay? And so it's like, there's more opportunity now. And it would be silly of us almost not to be like, hey, let's actively think about how we can capitalize on this opportunity. Because somebody else is gonna do it, right? Except when somebody else does it, as a civilization, as a world, we rely on, there's a couple factors that need to be in place for someone to capitalize on these opportunities. First, you need to be competent, okay? Like you have to be able to and have the ability to capitalize. Mattamy Homes is very, very much so competent, right? One of the largest home builders. I think it's the largest privately held home builder in North America. So we're doing something right, okay? So we got that. The next part is we need to think unconventional, okay? So you need competence, but then you also need to be like, I need to be willing to do something a little bit different, right? And then there's a couple other things, but I think those first two things, if we adopt that mindset, we'll be able to take the next step and adopt some of these technologies. How many of you guys have heard of Bitcoin in the room? Okay. Have any of you invested in Bitcoin? Okay. So how many of you have heard of blockchain? Okay, great. So I just want to give a quick rundown for people in the room. Blockchain is the interesting technology that was developed, and coins like Bitcoin and Ethereum are applications built on the technology, right? Used for distributed or decentralized currencies. And to give you a sense of why this was so innovative, this is a decentralized network, and this is a distributed network. So this is more of a blockchain. This is kind of what exists today. So what exists today in the regular internet, right? You'll have a Facebook, you'll have an Uber, you'll have an Amazon. These are the center nodes, okay? If someone wanted to hack the center node, everything else and all these like side nodes here are us, like we'd be compromised, right? Our data would be compromised. You think about this Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook or some of these other companies getting cyber hacked, right? That poses a huge threat to data that's really close to us, financial records, all that stuff. In a distributed network, if you hack one of the nodes, the rest of the nodes can still support you, right? So the whole network doesn't go down. You would literally have to hack over 50% of the network to actually take over the system. Now that's a really hard thing to do. This is why this is so important. Because when you think about security, when you think about transparency, right, and not having the ability to censor stuff, the list goes on. The ability to potentially speed up transactions tens, hundreds, thousands fold, because now instead of going here all the way to here, you can just go like here to here. Or if you wanted, to get from here to here, you can actually just go from here to here. So this is why it's a big deal. Okay, so if we think about Bitcoin, I Googled Bitcoin and I typed in January 1st, 2010, okay? This is around 8 years ago. Nothing comes up, nothing, okay? So Bitcoin was actually created around 2010 after the financial crisis as some way to safeguard and hedge against global powers that be, right? But there's nothing here. Literally in 1 year, so that's the end of Bitcoin then, right? This is 2011. So in 1 year, like Bitcoin came out, it was doing really well, and then everybody thought it was gonna crash, right? There was a Mt. Gox hack, fell from $17 to pennies. Everyone's like, Bitcoin's done. This is from 2013 to where it is now. There's over a 45,000% growth in the price, which reflects the adoption of Bitcoin, okay? 45,000%. Imagine you invested $100, right, way back when. And this just goes to show how much people want it, okay? And how fast, this is literally, most of the gains have happened in a 2-year period. So adoption's happening really fast. This is a new gene editing technology called CRISPR, okay, CRISPR-Cas9. What this is able to do is, we've had gene editing technologies in the past, but this is 100 times faster and more accurate and cheaper than traditional gene editing methods. So if you think about currently labs were the ones who had the gene editing power, but now you're democratizing this in the hands of people. Like one of my kids was working in a lab. She was 14 or 15 years old at the time. She was able to cure muscular dystrophy in mice. Like, that's never been done before. And she was working with a team, of course, but now there's a possibility to cure some of these diseases in less than 2 weeks in a lab. And it's more so the regulatory process that's going to prevent some of these drugs and whatever else is the case for coming out. But we have that technology to do that. One of our students was working in a lab, this is a different student, that was able to double the lifespan of fruit flies, right? Using something called heat shock proteins and playing around in there, right? But now when you think about our own human longevity, Peter Diamandis, he's the founder of the X Prize. He's also sold a company. He's very influential in the innovation community. He's invested in a couple longevity startups. I think he's around 60, 65 years old. He predicts, based on his current knowledge of the trajectory of these longevity companies, he's going to live till he's around 150 years old, right? And then think about what that means for some of us who are a little bit younger, 200, 250, 300, we don't know, right? But there is that possibility. This is what's happening in the world. So when you type in CRISPR again in 2010, nothing really comes up. And now when you type in CRISPR, this is a couple months ago, scientists using CRISPR, the gene edit tool for low-fat pigs, mail-to-order CRISPR kits, a revolutionary new gene editing technology on track to be a $10 trillion market, all this stuff. Again, such a short period of time. And these are some companies that were founded just a couple of years ago. And I went on Google Finance and I went to 1 year back, right? Like how fast are these companies growing? Well, this company has a $1.7 billion market cap. So literally in a couple of years, you're able to create a $1 billion company in the sciences, not even technologies now, like gene editing companies can be $1 billion companies. And the stock price doubled, right? Same goes for Sangamo Therapeutics, right? They're a $1.5 billion company. Intellia is a $1 billion company. Artificial intelligence is a term you might be familiar with, right? This is the buzzword that's going around now. When you think about the global economic impact of what this is able to do, right? Artificial intelligence is essentially the outcome. So this is the way I like to think about it. And it's tools like machine learning, computer vision, natural language processing, all that fun stuff that creates this really interesting outcome, which allows us to take data and make way better, faster, and more meaningful decisions, okay? So the economic impact of this is going to be more than the economic impact of a country, Canada, right? 7 trillion in China, 3.5 trillion or 3.7 trillion in North America. Like, this is huge. And then how many organizations now, like, why is it typically some of the largest tech companies in the world that like, I'm going to start thinking about this today? Because they're going to be the ones who reap the benefit, part and parcel because they have the quote unquote talent to do that. But we can get the talent. We just have to make the effort, and we just have to have that intention, okay? And by we, I mean other companies that aren't the Facebooks and Googles and the Ubers of the world, right? When you think about it from a Canadian context, like even the government, okay? Even the government is trying to get in on this. And you know when the government's trying to get in on this, then it's like, okay, if we're not in on this, we're behind, okay? So Google bets on AI in Canada with Google Brain, the Vector Institute, they're pouring in a lot of money. In Montreal, Element AI raised $135 million recently, and these are like unprecedented numbers here in Canada, to make a huge play in artificial intelligence. Justin Trudeau, right? He's up talking with some really influential people, the chairman of Google, Eric Schmidt, and Larry Page, and some of these other folks, right? How many leaders in the world are meeting with CEOs of these companies on stage in front of everyone being like, hey guys, we need to shake it up. In the budget, they put $1.26 billion in there, right, for their Strategic Innovation Fund. So the government is doing this. And I know we have the intention, but it's like, okay, let's take this seriously now and do it in a really big way. These are some headlines from earlier this year, like stuff that's actually happening today. Read this headline. How crazy does this sound? New DNA nanorobots successfully target and kill off cancerous tumors. The first time I looked at that, I'm like, really? Like, are we serious that this is actually happening? And I know about a lot of these things that are happening in the world. Like, the problem with cancer right now, if we think about chemotherapy or radiotherapy or surgery and some of these other tools that aren't particularly as effective, is that they don't target specific cancer cells. But now we've essentially created nanorobots to specifically target the cells that have cancer and destroy them, which is way less invasive than we've previously been doing it, right? Scientists make electronic skin that can sense and touch temperature and heal itself. And you guys should be thinking, so what? Like, what can I use this for? Well, imagine prosthetics, right? Someone doesn't have a leg or someone doesn't have an arm. Now you can attach this e-skin to their prosthetics, and they can almost feel and touch and get some of their senses back that they couldn't have done before. And when prosthetics technology advances, you might not soon be able to tell that they have a prosthetic. And you might actually want to be bionic in that sense because there are more advantages for being better, stronger, faster, whatever. And this is going to happen in such a short period of time. Think about virtual reality, right? I'm not sure how many of you have played around with these virtual reality headsets, but imagine a world where you have fully immersive virtual reality technology, okay? And in that world, you can pick up an apple or touch a chair. And using sensors on your fingers, you can actually feel. You can feel that chair. You can feel that apple. And then that's when Elon Musk starts talking about, like, maybe we're all just in a simulation right now, right? When he does the math, there's a high probability that that's the case, right? How many of you watched the Olympics recently in Korea, South Korea? So 5G made its global debut at the Olympics. It is 1,000 times faster than 4G. So like what you have on your phone, it's 1,000 times faster. And you're probably thinking, like, why do I need something to be 1,000 times faster to watch like my YouTube videos on my phone or to like load a website? That's not what it's about. Imagine self-driving cars when they're on the road and they need to communicate with thousands of other cars at the same time with satellites, all this stuff, in split seconds, like 0.1 second. We heard about what happened with Uber, right? Where Uber's self-driving vehicle crashed into a person and killed them. Because the reaction time, part of the reason was, and there's a lot of reasons, part of the reason could have been that the reaction time was just too slow to react at night. Well, what if we just had faster signals to allow us be able to actually adapt just as fast or even faster? This is why this is so important. This is a company called Impossible Foods. Okay? I'm not sure how many of you have heard about this, but if we think about beef today, okay, or just meat in general, but particularly beef, if you give a cow 100 pounds of protein to eat, they only retain 3 pounds of protein, which is a 3% technology. Like, where in the world would we ever accept a 3% technology, right? But we do it today, and we've been doing it forever. It takes 19,000 water bottles worth of water to make 1 pound of meat. Doesn't this sound insane? But we do it. Well, what if there was a better way, right? Because if you think about what beef is just fat, protein, a little bit of carbs, like here and there, essentially none. I don't know if I mentioned water, and it's just micro and macronutrients. Well, what if we could just build that from the ground up? Makes sense, right? So this is what this company is doing.
I grew up eating burgers probably once a week. On Sunday, my family would go out, buy a bunch of burgers, bring them home, and watch a movie on TV. It's such a canonical food. The flavor and aroma and texture and the juiciness and, all of that. But there's this huge dilemma that's posed by the fact that the way that we're producing meat is using a land area bigger than North America, South America, Australia, and Europe combined. The cows living on Earth outweigh every environment animal by a factor of 10. Animal farming is using the amount of oil that could fill San Francisco Bay every day. So how in the world are we going to do this? There's actually an incredibly simple solution. Give people all the meat that they want, but just produce it from completely non-animal sources. What we had to do was some really, really deep fundamental science to understand, just in molecular terms, all the features of a burger. When you have the experience of the aroma and the flavor of beef in your head, it's just, this can only be one thing, a delicious fresh cooked burger.
So anyway, I think we get the point, right? But it's how can we create meat from its fundamental macro and micronutrients level so we don't have to keep doing this almost insane thing. Like, I really believe in my heart of hearts in like 20 to 50 years, we're gonna be looking back on us and being like, this was so archaic. Like, I can't believe we were still doing this stuff, right? This is our traditional energy source, okay? So coal, fossil fuels. From 2011 to 2017, the total amount of coal factories that have been slated to be created have dropped by 75%, okay? And this is the Global Coal Index reflecting supply as well. This is actually from another presentation, Singularity University, Ramez Nam, he's a professor. He's super well connected into the energy landscape here, and he's been getting a lot of really interesting data about what's happening on a global scale when it comes to energy. So oil and gas, coal, fossil fuels going down in terms of production being created. When you think about wind energy, there's been 6.5 times growth of wind energy in the last 10 years. And most of that has been happening recently. In fact, back in 2015 or 2014, wind was considered infeasible. Now it's one of the cheapest sources of energy, even cheaper than fossil fuels, okay? Because when you look, it's a 15% price decline. The average price for wind is 4 cents per kilowatt hour. And I'll give you some context of what that means, okay? So wind is 4 cents per kilowatt hour. Fossil fuels right now on average are on average like 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. 3.8 cents per kilowatt hour. By the way, these are numbers you can just drop at random cocktail parties to make you sound like you know the random price of things per kilowatt hour. So in Morocco, these are some recent bids. Wind energy, a wind plant went for 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So this is what companies are bidding to install wind farms. So that's huge. We know the 4 cents is on average, but right now 2.8 cents per kilowatt hour is what we're getting in Morocco. When we think about solar, the cost of solar is also dramatically decreasing, a 250 times price decline, okay? But I want you to think about this for a second. In 1977, or whenever solar came out, right, it was like $64 per kilowatt hour. Of course we would think that's absurd, right? Of course we were like, some people in the world were like, this is never gonna work, okay? So those people who have that mentality don't understand the bigger picture. So of course when new technologies come out, you have to invest, you bring the cost down, you improve that technology. So when we're thinking about our innovation, and when we're thinking about what we want to do today with this company, even these VR headsets, we shouldn't be thinking about today. Like, how can this help me today? We should be thinking of what this looks like in the next 5 to 10 years. Be able to predict that, and then let's work backwards. Then let's figure out where to start. Because that's how we'll be able to stay ahead. In Mexico, the latest bid was 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. In Chile, we got 2.9 cents per kilowatt hour. This is in Dubai. I think the lowest bid that we've seen in the world to date, which is around 2.4 cents per kilowatt hour. And these are some of the companies that were bidding. And it's this Marubeni Gico Solar, one for 2.4 cents per kilowatt hour. So think about like 2 years ago when solar was coming out, okay? Everyone was like, yeah, we should move to solar. It's cleaner, it's more green, right? Global warming and climate change is happening, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so now you don't have to be emotionally incentivized to switch to solar. There's a clear economic incentive to switch to solar. It's just cheaper. It's cheaper and better than fossil fuels. So now when we're thinking about home building, okay, and the ability to build homes in places that are typically off-grid, well, now we might be able to do that, right? Especially since we have increased transportation. Increased transportation, I mean innovations in transportation to be able to go places, faster, have increased access to urban cities and some of this stuff. Well, now we can just have solar panels be our roof, essentially, connect to a power wall, and we could build in places where we might have historically not been able to build, right? So when we're going through these technologies, some of them might be completely irrelevant to living and home building, but some of them might have some really interesting implications. Virtual reality is something that we've kind of been teasing around here, right? Let's take that to the next level. Again, thinking about 5 to 10 years, what this means for us. Imagine you have a client, and imagine that client wants to put on a VR headset, and based on what they want, it will build it for them in their virtual environment. So you can tell exactly what the client wants to see and what's their ideal home. How crazy is that? This is the first step. I just want to be clear, he's controlling this stuff without a controller. He's doing it with his mind, right? So he's controlling virtual reality with his mind. Now, it's not crazy then to think about a world where you're actually creating things with your mind. That's actually what one of my students is working on right now. Imagine you go into a virtual world, and just with your mind you can be like, I want to create a steel building that's like 20 feet high, and I just want to kind of put it over there. But you're just thinking this stuff. And then using artificial intelligence and other technologies, it'll create this building and put it in this virtual world. And I can build some really interesting virtual worlds completely just based on what someone is thinking. And someone said this recently, and I forget who it was, but they said language hasn't completely evolved to articulate how we feel, right? Like we use language to articulate how we feel, but imagine a world of complete empathy where like you could just know how I feel based on what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. It's so interesting to think about. The last thing that I want to talk about in terms of like really cool and crazy technologies and whatever is autonomous flying vehicles. How many of you think this is like 20 years plus away? Okay, see, now you're probably going to be like, he showed me a bunch of cool stuff. It's 2 years away, so I don't want to look dumb and put my hand up right now. There's probably over 40 companies in the world that are testing autonomous flying vehicles right now. Like, forget about just regular autonomous vehicles. I can't believe I'm saying regular autonomous vehicles, right? Like, they're not even out yet, and we're like, oh yeah, that's so yesterday. Like, let's talk about flying cars, right? One of my friends, he's actually the head of machine learning at Uber. And we were talking, and Uber's flying car division right now, autonomous flying car division right now, is slated to come, they're testing all this stuff, is slated to commercially be tested by around 2019, 2020. There are other companies, so Larry Page, one of the founders of Google, he also recently came out with a flying car company that's been in the news literally like 2-3 days ago, where they're in a stage right now where they're seriously commercializing their autonomous flying vehicles, right? So like all this stuff is happening, but we might have just not heard about it, right? But again, when you think about autonomous flying vehicles, what does that mean for homes, right? If I can get to an urban city, in 20 minutes, whereas historically it would have taken me an hour and a half, now all of a sudden I can live in places where I historically couldn't have lived, right? And when you think about apartments versus homes and whatever else the case in rural areas versus cities, now you might starting to see these young professionals actually live in way nicer areas if it only takes them a 15-minute plane ride, car ride to get here. So I just want to show you what this looks like. This is the future they've imagined. So just like you would call a regular Uber, you'd call your Uber flight or whatever it is. And I'm letting the video play because I want us to really internalize what this experience could look like. Like, this is real, this is conceivable, and it will be a reality in the next, I would say, 3 to 6 years. Even autonomous vehicles, when I ask the average person, right, when do they think autonomous vehicles are actually going to hit the road? Most people are saying 20 years, 15 years plus. Like, that is not the case. They're testing them right now. I wake up to them every single day in Silicon Valley, right? It's really just up to municipalities when to adopt them, but they're here, okay? So again, what does this mean for home building? So now I want to go to the second part of the presentation, right? When we talk about digital transformation, okay, so what does this mean for us? How do we do this? Showed you a lot of really cool technologies in the world. Okay, cool. Now we have a better understanding. Now we can, blow our friends' minds when we're talking about these things and feel like experts, all that stuff. Got some value there. But what does this mean for us? How should we start thinking about this as an organization? Okay. The word innovation has been muddled down so much. It means different things to different people. And I don't think we're on the same page when someone says innovation versus somebody else. So now there's almost 3 tiers, 3 levels of innovation, okay? The first is incremental. It's like, how do we do things a little bit better, a little bit faster, a little bit cheaper, right? It's this whole concept of better, faster, cheaper. It's incrementally better. Then there's disruptive, right? Disruptive innovation is how can we do things a lot better, a lot faster, a lot cheaper. And then there's transformative, which is completely makes things possible that was historically just not even possible. Completely changing the game, okay? The reason why I bring this up is because when we talk about innovation and our digital transformation and digital innovation and whatever other buzzwords we want to use, we want to make sure we're aligned in terms of what we're talking about. Are we talking about putting in place a way better, like CRM, for example? Or are we talking about using machine learning to use this data and figure out exactly what customers want, 3 years before we currently are doing these things now? Like, that's the difference between incremental and disruptive. So I'll give you an example of incremental innovation. So one of my really good friends who I'm currently working with, I've known him for years, he's like the perfect physical human specimen. Okay, if you just looked at him, he's like 5% body fat or something like that. He's crazy. So he's put me on this plan. He's like, Nadeem, you gotta go on a thing. You're getting a little heavy. So I was like, okay, fine. What do we need? We need protein. So I got this protein. It's supposed to be like some of the best protein. And I'm like reading this package. It says cutting edge innovation on this package. I'm like, how much more cutting edge can protein get, right? Like, this is what they're trying to sell me on. I'm like, where's the innovation here? It is pretty good. It completely dissolves, like, instantly. It's an isolated protein. Highly recommend it. They didn't pay me to say that. But no, it is really good, but it just mixes things a little bit better, right? That's their cutting edge innovation. And it tastes really great too. But this is to give you an example of like how we're kind of, innovation to someone might mean something very different to somebody else, right? It's a clear selling point on their package. Okay, so now let's think about disruptive innovation, right? How do we do things a lot better, a lot faster, a lot cheaper? Well, I'd say this is kind of like Netflix to Blockbuster, right? This is more of like the Airbnb to hotel companies, the Amazons to Chapters, Barnes and Nobles, all that stuff. Like this is really disruptive, right? Because historically, it's like you're still watching movies, you're still doing the same things, but you're just making the accessibility way higher. You're making it cheaper. You're creating a model where you're making it almost social. Okay, it's just a clearly better way of doing things. Like I can't imagine. This is one of those things where it's like I cannot imagine ever wanting to go to a physical store right now, getting our VHS or DVD or whatever, and putting it in. It's like I would just load this thing up. It's just way better. It's just clearly way better, okay? So this is what I would say is disruptive innovation. Then there's transformative. Like, holy crap, this completely changed the world. And it's not going to be something that you're thinking of like, oh, this is like a crazy quantum computing technology, because I really want you to think about it for a second, is planes, okay? Planes was so transformative in terms of the way we just lived our everyday life. Like, think about international business. Historically, we would need to take a car and take a boat, and that would take like weeks, maybe months, right, to get across the world. Now I can get from here to Australia in like 15 to 20 hours, less than a day. So now when you're thinking about international business, when you're thinking about communities, when you're thinking about globalization, all of these things completely changed our civilization. Like if you teleported or time traveled someone from 100 years ago, their experience would be completely different. Even when you think about, so I was reading a book by Aziz Ansari called Modern Romance, and it talks about like dating statistics and all this stuff and how dating has kind of changed today versus years and years ago. So he interviewed older couples, I think 60 plus, and he interviewed younger couples that are typically, divorce rates are a lot higher and they don't seem to be as happy in their relationships, blah, blah, blah. The young people millennial phenomenon. Yeah, we get it. We'll get over it. We'll figure it out. But I think it was like 80 or 85% of these couples, 60 plus, met within a 1 kilometer radius of each other, right? Because it's like you grow up, you're not really going anywhere, right? It's like you go to work, you're in your communities, go home, and you do the same thing. And it's typically the first person who they met, who they liked, they got married to. Now for us, it's like we can go on Tinder and be like, 30 kilometers away isn't that bad because I can take this, like crazy GO train, or I can even put myself in another city because I'm going to be traveling every other city every couple days, and I'll meet someone, and as soon as they say one wrong thing, whatever, I can just swipe right one more time, and maybe I'll get a better person, right? Like, it's just so interesting the way in which we think about these things, and planes were really transformative to our society, okay? So when we think about identifying these opportunities, I really want us to start thinking about it in this lens, okay? What can be truly transformative? So when you're thinking about Mattamy, okay? Like imagine what could be completely transformative to our business versus disruptive versus just incremental. Like one of the things that I'm thinking about right now is imagine homes just looked really garbage, right? And they were super cheap and they were just a place for someone to live, but everybody, or most people, just woke up every single day in their very cheap, inexpensive home and put on this virtual reality headset, and they could just feel like they're in a way better place, right? Which is way cheaper. Now when you're thinking about home building, right? Now it's a software company. It's just way cheaper, right? And you can just teleport to someone else's house instantly, but it can look and feel. I'm not sure if you've seen that movie recently, Ready Player One, where it talks about being fully immersed in a VR world. Like that would be super transformative for a home building company. And then when you think about disruptive innovation, so think about Airbnb is the largest accommodation company in the world, but doesn't own any houses or apartments, okay? Uber is the largest transportation company in the world and doesn't own any cars, right? So what could that be for Mattamy, right? Like I was thinking about it. Imagine if individuals could buy plots of land, right? And they could just go on like Mattamy software, whatever, design their own home. They can print it, would automatically just be prefabbed, right? So you press a button, it comes, gets delivered in a couple weeks or something like that. And Now instead, because you didn't have to buy the land and your costs are way cheaper, whatever else is the case, now you're essentially acting as the banks providing mortgages to these people. They're paying sort of like a subscription model to get their house, and after 5 years they own the house, but you didn't have to own any of the land, you didn't have to build the communities, fully customizable, whatever, right? So it's like, what is like the Uber of home building, right? It's very interesting. And someone's going to do it. I guarantee you someone's going to do something. It's just, is it going to be us, right? Or is it going to be someone else? So let's look at best-in-class organizations. I talked about Airbnb a little bit. So Airbnb, the founders, Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia, they were like dead set on being entrepreneurs. They failed like 7 times, okay? And they were running out of money. They were living in this small place in Silicon Valley, and they just needed a way to get money in order to survive. There was this big conference that was coming to town, and they're like, hey, what if we just buy a bunch of air mattresses and post on like Kijiji or whatever it was at the time, Craigslist, to see if people would pay. And people did pay. And people paid a lot. So by accident, they discovered this concept of Airbnb, which is staying in other people's homes. And now it's a $38 billion company or whatever. So that's how they identified their opportunity. It was almost by serendipity, but they capitalized on it, right? And they did something to test the market. How can I do something very easily to validate whether someone would use the service or not? So this is Garrett and Travis. These are the founders of Uber. They had started and sold previously successful companies. They were in Paris for a conference. It was snowing, right? They ordered a cab. They didn't know where it was, and it was like they were just so frustrated, right? They were so frustrated. And I think Garrett said, over here, he's like, what if I could just push a button and a cab could come to me in style? Like, and I could just track where it is, right? Like, that's all he said. And so it was building something he wanted, built out of his own personal frustration. And they were able to just start Uber because they executed on it. Ideas are a dime a dozen, right? I guarantee you, like, thousands of other people had thought of this Uber idea, but they didn't do it, okay? The reason why this group here is particularly interesting and well-positioned to do this is because you touch the customers. Like, you have the most power every single day, right? You know what the customers want. So now you could, if you put on your empathy hats and you're like, like, build something I want. What do the customers want, right? And really impact change that way. You got to go through the first steps, and you got to go through exercises and collect data and whatever to figure it out. But you are the ones, I think, to do that. And we think about Elon Musk, right? Like, how did he take on this journey? So he was at X.com, went to PayPal, sold that, and then he was like, I want to do some crazy stuff. I want to start SpaceX. Because to him, it was so silly that we hadn't been to space since like the 70s, I think it was, 60s or 70s, right? And he's like, we need to be eventually an interplanetary species, because the sun's going to blow up eventually. Like, it's going to happen. It's not going to be in the next thousands of years or whatever, but it's going to happen. But nobody's doing it. And his dream was, like, it wasn't just putting the weight of humanity on his shoulders, right? I think that would be a super exhausting and taxing job. But his quote was, I want to die on Mars, just not on impact. Right? It's like, I want to die on Mars, just not on impact. And so he started SpaceX, and the motivating, burning desire there was just something, a vision that he had for a civilization, right? Like, it was just this burning vision. He just knew that this had to be manifested. Even with Tesla, like, he didn't found Tesla. He was a very early investor in Tesla, and he stepped in as the CEO. In his mind, he could see a world that was just completely built around electric vehicles. Like, how we were historically doing things just didn't make sense, right? And so he sort of enacted that vision. So again, when I would think about, for Mattamy, is like, in our organization, who are these people, who are these visionaries, and who are these thinkers, right? And who are imagining worlds that are completely different than the way they exist today, and let's enable them, right? Like, let's really figure out how we can enable some of these people. And then we have Amazon, and with his story of, if you actually go on YouTube and you type in Jeff Bezos, like 1995 or 1996, you'll get a bunch of videos of reporters just making fun of Jeff Bezos, right? being like, yeah, you're crazy, like, yeah, this is never gonna happen, like, what is this internet thing, whatever, right? But he just had such conviction. He's like, I see the internet taking off, right? Just like you might be seeing technologies like IoT and sensors and artificial intelligence, whatever, taking off right now, blockchain, and be like, I know this is gonna be a big thing. It doesn't make sense. This is not gonna go away, right? So I can either capitalize on it, because he was like, people are selling pet food online and it was getting really popular. He's like, why can't you sell books? And that's how it started. And now he's plus or minus depending on the day, the wealthiest man in the world. Amazon is secretly taking over our society, okay? But I think in potentially a really cool way. And it literally just took him to do that. So now actually then going back to kind of previous technologies, because this is just something I'm really excited about. When you think about blockchain, right? I think blockchain today is like internet in 95. Like people didn't really know how we were gonna use it. We didn't know we were gonna have social networks. We didn't know that we were gonna have e-commerce or like a lot of these really interesting things. But like we just felt like it was gonna be big. That's what it kind of is today. And some of these other technologies too. Like some of them are a little bit more further advanced and some of them are like quantum computing or still very much experimental. But it's like when you get a whiff of something and you have some conviction because you just have more information than other people, like literally after this hour, you'll have more information than most other people. So you'll be able to make better decisions, right? So now when we compare a larger company to a startup, because all of those companies, Airbnb, Uber, Amazon's, were all startups at one point in time, right? To me, I was thinking about like, why do startups have to even exist? You know, like if you think about bigger companies and established companies, we have the talent, we have the experience, we have the networks, we have the money, right? Like we have all these things. Like why is this some random person in their basement able to completely disrupt me and steal billions in dollars of value? Like why can't I just do that? There are two big reasons, in my opinion. The first is incentive, right? So like imagine if you're at this organization right now and you're like, yeah, I have this really good idea and I need to put in a lot of work to make it happen. It's like, okay, well you can put in that lot of work, but is it very clear how you get rewarded for doing that, right? Is that incentive structure there? Say you're just like really passionate about something. Say you don't really care about the incentive structure. And you're like, I just want to do it because it's something I'm really excited about. Then the second thing that could block you is bureaucracy, right? Like you really wanting to do something, but then just the person a little bit more senior being like, nah, I think we should wait. And you're like, no, but like, I'll sacrifice a bunch of the stuff. I'll just do it. And be like, yeah, I don't want to say yes right now, right? So those two things cause friction, which takes really smart people out of their ecosystems to go into startups and to, shake up the game and then steal billions in dollars of value. Where it's like, well, we could have just used our people to do it for us in the first place, right? And so, part of that comes from risk aversion, but, again, I would encourage us to really think about, and it seems like this is a really good environment because we're talking about, our risk appetite and willing to, go to the next level and take on this journey of digital transformation. So it's there, we have that mindset, right? But really think about like how can we start enabling people in the organization to get stuff done? Because there's going to be a lot of young people in your organization that have some really cool ideas, right? And how to implement technologies and do all that stuff. And I think it's just really important being a little bit more flexible and thinking about like, okay, if I can't make this decision as a leader here, because I don't know how much this will impact me, let me hire someone to help me figure that out, right? Like if I don't have the best knowledge to make these decisions, let's bring in people who do. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this mindset piece. We talked about really cool things happening in the world. Now I want to put those two things together and show you how it's being applied to home building, okay? And at the very least, I think this will spark some very interesting ideas for some of you, okay? So there's this company called Module. Very, very interesting. So if someone moves into a home, think about like a single person, they get their plot of land. And maybe they start off, right, small, with kind of this two-story home there. Now, say maybe you get a family or a job promotion, right? It's just very modular. You'll add on this section of the house, and they've built it with this intention. And then you get a family and you add on another section of the house, right? And now all of a sudden you have this modular housing that historically, like there's no reason why this can't exist. It just doesn't really, right? And so what do we need to do to make this commonplace if this makes sense? This is what some company is doing right now, right? Then we have something called Ori, kind of after origami, right? To really think about in the same amount of space, how can we be really thoughtful about our design? So put more and less, and to really make it feel like it's a really cool experience. So you have your beds, right? And you have your closets and you have all that stuff. And so now you can move things around and make more of less, right? And increase the affordability of places, increase the utilization of spaces, all that stuff. And this is just about being very thoughtful when it comes to design. I thought this was a really cool concept. This is a company called Augment, right? So using augmented reality, not virtual reality. So augmented reality overlays something digital on our real environment, whereas virtual reality just creates a completely virtual world. So this company was like, we have our floor plans and we have our blueprints and all that stuff. How can I just see what this looks like before we even, make our next iterations and go to production? Companies like IKEA are doing this right now with their furniture. Right, so now imagine you can go to your customers in advance before even building, before even making really, investing a lot of the time and money to making these blueprints, be like, hey, is this what you want? No, you want me to add this in? Okay, is this what you want? So you're moving towards customizable housing, saving costs, being able to visualize what the experience might look like before. And if you take that a step further and you think about augmented reality glasses, what might this actually look like on the home building site, right? How can I make things, again, better, faster, cheaper using augmented reality? You guys get the picture there, right? And some of you who have any experience with construction or contractors, whoever, you're like, there's no way in hell they're going to use any of this stuff, right? What's interesting is those companies that I talked about, SRI and Daiquiri, they're testing that right now with large contractor companies, and they are using it because it makes their lives way better, like way easier. We saw on there, like just even measurements, right? And not having to measure things and trust that with a greater degree of accuracy, right? I don't think the sharing feature is being used as much, but there's so much value just knowing where you are in the space because you have your blueprint and floor plan in like your top left-hand corner, right? When we think about disruptive, to me, that feels very disruptive when you're talking about it from a home building context. This is a company called Blueprint Robotics. They're doing brief prefab, but they're doing it in a little bit of a different way, right? We all know prefab. I think we're doing it right now with some walls and roofs and things like that. What they're essentially doing is if you think about Legos, right? You can have a bunch of Legos, but just build them in very interesting ways. They're thinking about ways using artificial intelligence and generative design and all that stuff to build almost like Tetris-like walls and roofs and floors and foundations and whatever else that you could essentially have these building blocks and you can put them together in whatever ways that you want. And I think it's reducing the actual building time on site from a couple months to a couple weeks, because you literally just have to put things together, interlock them, and then put cement in, yada, yada, all that stuff. So that's really interesting. They just have this huge factory that's doing that right now. The next technology that I would highly recommend thinking about is 3D printing, right? When we think about 3D printing, traditionally it's been like, okay, how can we create, like, maybe one of your kids at their school, they have a 3D printer and they're making this cool like plastic things. Okay, yeah, fine, that's cute, whatever. But right now we're actually using composite materials to build buildings. And this is something, to me, that could almost be transformative in the way we live, right? Because now I'm going to show it to you, but think about like how we almost might not need permanent homes anymore.
This house was built in 24 hours. How? Thanks to modern technology, Core 3D printing. Core, building the future today.
You see that? That home was built in 24 hours using composite materials. So not just plastics anymore, but concrete mixed with some other stuff, right? To build an actually structurally sound, well-built home. And when I was talking about like you don't need permanent homes anymore, I was like, imagine you just wanted to go to a place, build your home, break it down, recycle those materials, and repurpose spaces for different things. That company allows you to do that. And you don't need to go, when you're thinking about all these technologies, even if you want to implement them in your organizations, you don't need to be like, oh, okay, we need to have 3D printer, large 3D printing technologies that build homes. It can be like, no, what if I just want to build one piece? Right? Like when you're looking at some of these things and they might seem too crazy and that it doesn't feel like it's something that you can get involved with today, just think about, well, that's what's possible. Actually, you should take that, imagine what that's going to be like in 10 years, and then be like, well, what does step one kind of mean for us? Arevo is doing free motion printing, so kind of what you saw before, but it allows you to be a little bit more flexible in your 3D printing journey. There's some really cool stuff. I just put it on here in case a couple of you wanted to write it down because it's just a cool, interesting technology that's coming out. Then we have Autodesk here in Toronto. And some of you who have been to Mars, you'll be familiar with this building, but these are the guys who are leading the charge, I would say, almost globally in generative design. And this is probably going to be the most relevant for you today, okay? So when you think about generative, particularly this group in this room, okay, when you're thinking about designing homes, when you're thinking about materials, whatever else is the case, I think this is going to be huge for any physical structure industry.
Generative design is starting by specifying the high-level goals and constraints of a project, and then using the power of computation to automatically generate, evaluate, and evolve hundreds or thousands or even hundreds of thousands of design options to explore a very wide design space of possibilities.
I call generative design my virtual design associate. It takes care of all the process work and option analysis.
We've been using it to design many different iterations and try new things. It's given us the ability to test things very, very quickly. A lot of people think of computers and they think of automation and they instantly sort of say, oh, does that mean you can do everything in a fraction of the time? But
like this is in Toronto, this is in the Mars building.
Timelines where something that takes you 100 hours suddenly reduces to 50. So the fact that what you can do within those 100 hours is so much more.
There are definitely benefits to generative design, such as reduction in waste. As a designer, you would be more connected to manufacturing and.
Yeah, I think we get the general idea there. And then the last thing, and this is something for if you know of any engineering or architect folks, something that could dramatically lower the costs in your business is looking to material sciences and nanomaterials to really rethink what we're using to put into our buildings today. So this is a material called graphene. I'm not sure if a lot of you have heard of it, but it's one of the strongest and most lightweight materials in the world. And it'll show you that in the video, right? But it's like, okay, there's just new materials that we can use to build things.
Graphene. In its two-dimensional form, graphene is thought to be the strongest of all known materials. But translating that two-dimensional strength into useful three-dimensional materials has posed quite the challenge to researchers for decades. But now, a team of MIT engineers has successfully designed a new 3D material with 5% the density of steel and 10 times the strength, making it one of the strongest, lightweight materials known. And by analyzing the material's behavior down to the level of individual atoms, they were also able to produce a mathematical framework that can accurately predict experimental results.
So like all that sciencey stuff, but I think the biggest thing there is you can get 20% lighter than steel and 10 times stronger than steel. And the cool thing is in the video, they were like, historically this had been cool, but now we're able to do it. Like that's the key, right? 2 years ago, this was not possible. Now this is possible. So now that this is a reality, how can we explore the material sciences and different ways to actually build our homes and maybe even make them safer for the people who are living inside of them. Then we have Skycatch. They overlay and use augmented reality on plots of land, and you can do a bunch of really interesting things with that. You can get precision data. Yeah, just cool stuff. Going back to organizations and going back to this attitude, okay? And I want to wrap up very soon here. The attitudes that many organizations have is, how can I mitigate risk versus optimize success? And this is actually very similar with parents. Like a lot of our students, they tend to do unconventional. Well, one of the things that we say at TKS is the only way to achieve unconventional success is to follow an unconventional path. Like you can't expect to do the same thing as everybody else and achieve a different result. Parents are like, yeah, I love that, right? I think that's great. Like I want my kid to be on the news. And then as soon as they start doing it and something sacrifices, like maybe grades go down like 2%, they're like, no, I'm scared. Like I just want my kid to get into university. And this is this whole concept of like, how can I just mitigate failure? I don't want my kid to screw up versus how can I really maximize their potential? And I think companies think the same way, right? It's mitigating risk versus like, how can we really set ourselves up to optimize for success? So Vinod Khosla, he's the founder of Sun Microsystems. He's on like Bill Gates status, okay? He's the reason why Silicon Valley is called Silicon Valley. He's one of the world's most prominent investors now. He says this quote, and it really resonated with me. He said it last year here in Toronto, actually, and I think it was the first time he's ever said it. He said, the consequence of mitigating risk makes the prospect of success inconsequential, okay? The consequence of mitigating risk makes the prospect of success inconsequential. This is actually what I think is one of the greatest secrets of life in general, okay? So imagine like this is your baseline, right? You have risk. If you take on this much risk, you take on this much reward, right? As soon as you start mitigating risk all the way here, then the amount of success that you get is like here, and it's like, so what's the point, right? Like the prospect of success almost becomes inconsequential. Now here's the greatest secret of life, and this will just apply to you anywhere you go. Perceived risk is actually far greater than actual risk, okay? So like if the rest of the world thinks that like something is this risky, it might actually only be this risky, but the reward is still proportional. You're never gonna get that anywhere in life, like in anywhere else, right? Where you have to this degree perceived risk being misaligned with actual risk. Like the stock market, for example, you might be able to arbitrage here and there, but nowadays with our technology, it's very small. But just in terms of like life decisions, say you were like, I really want to make a big play in VR. Like that might seem like so risky because it's not what we do, and like, we don't have the talent, we don't have the people. Like, what if we mess up this and that? It's like, yeah, okay, so what, right? Like the downside might just be some money, maybe, but you will have a lot more knowledge. You would have taken the first step. You would have gotten comfortable with ambiguity. And the next time that you do something, you might actually be a lot more successful. And so a lot of those values aren't taken into account when you want to try something new, okay? I want to give you this example. There's this company called Protein Cure, crazy company. They're essentially using quantum computing, okay? Quantum computing, in essence, will dramatically, by thousands of fold, increase our computational power that we have. So it's like way better than supercomputers. This is like a very simplistic way of describing it. They're using quantum computers and artificial intelligence to synthesize drugs, right? So it's like, let's put into the machine AIDS or some of these other diseases, and the machine using quantum computing will figure out what is the drug that we need for these big pharma companies to actually synthesize the drug and give it to you. So like accelerated drug discovery. So they presented here in Toronto at the Creative Destruction Lab, and they went up on stage and they presented this idea and they presented their technology, and like it was really cool. And the comments after kind of bugged me because these were some of the smartest people in Canada, and they're coming from other places as well. But the comments were like, it was very more negative than positive, which is fine. But it was quantum computers haven't been developed yet, so that's like a really big hesitation. Well, yeah, that's like saying when the internet was coming out telling someone not to work on like Facebook or something like that. Yeah, we don't know if it's going to be adopted, but given that's going to be adopted, this is something that's really cool. So that didn't really feel that powerful to me. And then B, they're like, oh yeah, but I don't know how you're going to, actually, there's a difference between simulating it and actually making it, so that's going to be your biggest challenges. And it's like, yeah, guys, like hard problems are hard to solve. We get that. There's a million reasons why not to do something. I would have so loved if for this company, these really smart people in the room just had a little bit of a different mindset, and they're like, this would have to be the situation for this to be ultra successful. These are all the parameters that would have to be in place for you to succeed, rather than pick apart everything wrong with this idea. Because like I said, there's a million reasons for why not to do things. If it was so apparent as to why we should do things, it would already be done right now, okay? And so when we think about our attitudes, next time something, we get a proposal or someone says a really interesting idea, instead of your reaction being like, why this won't work, be like, let me try and think about all the possible scenarios that this could work. And this is what this looks like. And then let's see if we can make this happen. And if we can't, then maybe we don't pursue this, right? I'm not saying those people who are giving criticisms about this company were right or wrong. It's just the mentality and the framing of these things, okay? So what can we do? What can we do, right? My biggest thing for organizations that are taking their first step is just hire someone. Just hire someone smarter or just who knows about how to actually do this thing called digital transformation or innovation, or how to even think about these things. Because now you've essentially, in my opinion, such a nominal amount swallowed up this knowledge that you historically just didn't have access to, right? I think I was looking online, Mattamy doesn't have a chief digital officer, correct?
No.
Not that historically we needed it, right? But we don't have it. Let alone that, after you have a CDO, it's like, do we have a CIO, like a chief innovation officer? Again, maybe historically we didn't need that, but maybe now is the right time to start thinking about it. Because if you're asking, well, I'll give you an example. So there was a large company that was testing summer internships with our students, okay? First time in history, like high school internship programs. So they called one of our students in to build them an AI chatbot, because what they had done before is they had paid, I think, $50,000 to $100,000 on getting their current employees to build AI chatbots for them. They have no idea how to do this, right? Spent a lot of time, a lot of money trying to figure it out. Couldn't do it. Hired one of my students. The goal was to design it, like what this looks like. She came in, built them 2 in a month, and then started working on their security features because she was actually focused on cryptography. And that was just like one thing she built during our program. And she ended up building 2 for them, right? So it's this idea of like, yeah, like don't try and get, the marketing folks or the engineering folks or whoever else you think is the most closely aligned to do these things. There's going to be a lot of friction. Just get someone who's done it before. And then this is really the call to action. Like going back to really what we're trying to do with home building. Like this is people's lives we're talking about here, right? Like this is such an important organization. I think over 30% on average of someone's pre-tax income is spent on where they live. This dictates their communities. This dictates often their environments, what they do for a living, right? Just where they live. And so I really challenge you, everybody in this room, like how can we shake it up? And how can we shake it up with the intention for our customers to just live more comfortable and fruitful lives every single day? Thanks.
Anybody have any questions for Nadeem?
Sorry, I talked for a super long time. We actually do, if you guys are serious about that. Yeah, there you go.
How did you come up with the idea for TKS? Like, what made you think of going to that next generation?
I mean, part of it was when we were in San Francisco, and again, thinking back on all the people who we grew up with who weren't really exposed to this stuff, that was the first question, like, why us? The second question was, why not us earlier, right? And this goes back to, like, it wasn't a secret. All these things weren't a secret. And for me, outside of these innovation landscapes like New York, San Francisco, Seoul, Austin, Tel Aviv, whatever, most of the world doesn't really have access to this. And when you think about human potential, like humans are our most important resource in the world. Not gold, not oil, right? But we have the most sophisticated tools to get this oil out of the ground. But we're still using pickaxes on a mountain right now to try and mine the resource of human potential. It's just something that really didn't make sense to us, and we're like, we just need to figure out a different way of doing it.
Anybody? How do you find your
Yeah, so there's an application. I didn't realize that this is the way I was going to go, but yeah, if you guys are interested in TKS, I'm happy to talk about it. There's an application and an interview process. Most students know we held a conference 2 months ago now where we brought in people from like NASA, Tesla, Instagram, Microsoft, Google, whatever, from Silicon Valley and other parts of the world, completely free on a weekend, so students actually have access to it, no adults allowed. And from that, and students just had to apply, but from that we have this huge buzz. So most students in Toronto kind of know who we are, and we're expanding to different cities, but we go through schools and like events and just figure it out. Yeah. Sure.
I mean, who do these young students aspire to work for? I think that's a challenge for established companies is the young kids don't want to work for Ford or for certain types of companies.
Well, so that's interesting.
Create their own, so.
Yeah, so some of them want to create their own. Innovation doesn't, and I said this before, so I think you know that it's not BS. Like startups don't have to exist, right? Entrepreneurship is a vehicle for making things happen. Intrapreneurship or within companies is another way. Research is another way, right? Part of the reason why, so there's a big bank here that just created their new digital factory, whatever, and their whole thing was like, yeah, how can we attract top tier talent, right? Now what's happening is that they're not actually attracting the top tier talent just because they made a really cool space. Why? Because top tier talent is attracted to working on hard problems, meaningful problems. So when you think about like, how do we get these really smart people to work for you? Of course it's not the money, it's not the budget, but it's like, do I have the flexibility and are we open-minded as much as an organization for me to actually make meaningful change? Because the thinking is if I join a traditional organization, it's going to be traditional thinking and it's just going to be way harder for me to get things done. If you just remove some of those barriers, you're going to get smart people to work for you.
Can I add to that? So I, a couple years ago, worked for Jones Lang LaSalle, which is typically like brokers, old school, old thinking, and they decided to hire a whole digital team to think like, how do we transform what was so old and 150 years to the next generation? So they developed this whole technology platform where you as a young startup company can go online, lease 3,000 square feet and pay monthly with a credit card. And they totally disrupted the entire commercial real estate leasing landscape with it. And their entire team is a bunch of 20-year-olds. And so, but that was a disruptor for that sector.
You just got to enable them, right? So it's about this like giving them the incentives and taking away the bureaucracy and people will come. But I think the biggest thing, part of it is that a lot of organizations don't even have the intention, the serious intention to bring on some of these people. Anyway.
It seems to me sometimes there's a gap that can happen between where technology and innovation might be and the mindset or the willingness of consumers to take it on. So I'm thinking specifically about Uber driverless car kills somebody and how far back that might set the progress. So I'm not sure what my question there is exactly, but what's your thought on overcoming public perception?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and this is the bar that tech and innovation companies have versus more traditional organizations. They're like, how can I make this not 20% better or 50% better? How can I make this 1,000% better so that it's unequivocal that you would want to use this technology? Like, I guarantee you in 20 years, we're going to be looking back on this world, and it's one of those things like, I can't believe we let humans drive because there were accidents. Because in 20 years, it's going to be impossible for there to be accidents. Now, of course, again, going back to that solar example, in 1977, it was super costly and there were a lot of problems with the panel. Well, that's what self-driving cars are today. Next year, when you think about their tests and their simulations, and by the way, in that particular example, it really was, there were a lot of different factors that led to that. It wasn't as much, I think, the technology. It's unfortunate that that kind of might have set it back a little bit more. But in a year or two, with a lot of these tests, you're going to start seeing with the data, there's like there's only a 0.00001% chance that you might get into an accident. That's way better than it is today. And then part of that is just change management. You start testing it in cities like in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, for example. They're way less risk averse. So then as soon as you start seeing that in that city or in San Francisco, more cities will adopt. That's exactly what happened with Uber, right? Uber started in San Francisco. They moved to like New York, a couple other cities. Now Calgary even has Uber, which is like, what? Calgary has Uber, right? But it's like, yeah, that's just change in the world.
So you had on one of your slides Internet of Things.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So
How that could apply to our industry?
yeah. So Internet of Things is essentially things that are connected. So devices that are connected to each other, whether they're to the internet or through Bluetooth. Typically, they're used for two things. One, gathering data, or two, to like activate things, right? So if like my phone is connected to my car, I want to unlock my car, I might use my phone to unlock my car, and that would kind of be, is my car being IoT enabled, is the Internet of Things. Or it can be like my Fitbit, when I'm walking, now it's all of a sudden tracking my steps. So when you're thinking about IoT and how that might be applied to you, and when you're thinking about sensors and all this stuff, be like, is there anything I can use to make something smart? And from an activation or collecting data perspective, right? And that could be collecting data on users. It doesn't even have to be from like a building perspective, but like from your customers. Are there any things like from their phone or even like, can I get their Fitbit data to see how far they're walking to and from work, and like, are they walking less? And if they are walking less and maybe they're driving more, can I build further away? You know what I mean? I don't know. But it's thinking about, again, how you can make the devices smart. And typically when you make them smart, it's either through an activation lens. So how can I like turn something on or off, or like make something happen, or just collect data behind it. So like smart clothes, for example, there's this, so they're making clothes smart now, where if you go work out and you're doing a push-up, now you don't need a personal trainer because it'll tell you exactly if you have bad form or whatever doing a push-up, because it can sense, it can get the data, give you some feedback, and now you're good, right? And you don't need that personal trainer adjusting your form or adjusting your posture, for example, is another one, right? So your clothes are smart enabled. As soon as you have poor posture, it can either, there's a vibration or it'll like tell you or whatever, and then you can just have better posture, right? I know I definitely need that.
How do you see like different generations accepting technology? So let's just say you have a 65-year-old retiree who is looking for a new home. What's the benchmark now for their tolerance of using technology to assist them? Or would they embrace a 3D printed home, or is that something that's just so far off to them? Like how far can we push it?
So there's two ways to answer that question. The first is, I think obviously younger people are more receptive to technologies. And historically, when you thought about intelligence, right, we were thinking about IQ, like how can we measure sheer raw intellectual horsepower? And we have really good ways of doing that. Then we started being like, just because you're the smartest people in the world doesn't mean you can actually make things happen. Now we need to think about like, what's our EQ, right? What's our emotional quotient? And then I think we're getting a lot better at figuring out what that is. There's this new thing and this new phenomenon that's happened in the last like 10 to 20 years that I would say called the AQ, your adaptability quotient. So how fast can you change? Now young people will have that way more than an older person because they grew up in an environment where things are constantly changing, and they feel more comfortable with that. So their AQ is a lot higher. So for young people, AQ will always be there. But to answer your question about older folks, I think it's how can you do it in such a way that they don't even know that it's technology, right? Like, they don't need to know that it's a 3D built printed home, right? They don't need to know that, that if, they come downstairs and their coffee automatically gets prepared in the morning, or if their lights are on, that it's solar paneled or whatever the case. Like, they don't need to know that. But it's just, in my opinion, all about experiences. If you can create a really interesting experience for your customers, I don't think they'll often question it, because you're providing them something of really immense value. And it's like, wow, this is something. And part of that is like with your demos. Do I want to demo that with VR when I bring someone into my house? Like, they can kind of get a sense of what that feels like, but providing really cool experiences and kind of masking this technology in the background.
Even the 75-year-old can say, Alexa, turn on the thermostat, right? So the technology is coming to the people.
Yeah. I mean, I guarantee you in probably 3 to 4 years, everyone is going to have some sort of Alexa or Google Home or something like that.
I just saw on the news this morning they're starting to put Alexas in hotel rooms, so I guess it's kind of all around.
There you go. And then it goes back to, when does something start becoming normal? Like, I think in a year or two, it's just going to be like, oh, I'm waking up every single day being like, hey Google, what's the weather today, right? Or hey Google, what's my schedule? Or hey Google, can you bring my car around? Or can you call an Uber, right? It's really interesting stuff.
Great. Well, on behalf of all of us here, thank you so much. You did not disappoint.
Thank you.
I think you've definitely opened our minds for the rest of our two-day conference. I'll leave you with a small token. It
Oh,
is
thank you so much.
not mind-controlled by any means.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Hope I didn't talk too long.